We've looked at typology and pottery and stone tools. And week we're going to look at the analysis of another kind of material that's recovered usually from archaeological excavations, and that is animal bones. We'll also be talking a little bit in connection with it with the remains of plants as well. But we're really going to focus on what's known as zooarchaeology. And zooarchaeology is different from archaeozoology. You would think, I think most people would think, oh, well, aren't they really the same thing? But actually not. When you look at the fields and you look at the term zooarchaeology, is the emphasis here is on archaeology. Using zoological remains or ancient animal bones in order to study archaeology, in order to learn about ancient human behavior. Archaeozoology, the emphasis is on the zoology. It's ancient zoology. The main point of the field is to study the ancient animals, to learn about the ancient animals, but not necessarily to learn about human behavior and human diet and what the animals can tell us about ancient human societies. So that's really the main difference. We're concerned with zooarchaeology because we want to look at the animal bones and the animal remains so that they can tell us a little bit about the human societies that use those animals. What you're going to see is that zooarchaeology depends a lot on comparative collections. And so you guys are going to do a little bit of identification of some animal bones and the age that the animals were killed in order to learn a little bit about how zooarchaeology works. But whereas many mammals have the same kinds of bones, like humeri, femurs, vertebrae, things like that, the morphology of the animal bones is a little bit different depending on the species. And that allows archaeologists to identify, using the animal bones, what species and also, as you're going to see, the age of the animal. So zooarchaeology is very, very useful. We're going to see that there's a lot that you can learn from studying ancient animal bones besides just the diet of ancient people. There's a lot more that you can discover as well. One of the basic forms of analysis that zooarchaeologists engage in is when they're given a collection of animal bones or that are recovered from an excavation, they try and figure out some basic characteristics such as the NSIP, the number of identified specimens, right? So just the total amount of bones that were recovered. From that, you have to figure out the minimum number of individuals. So if you have, let's say, 2 left femur of a horse, you obviously don't have one horse because one horse is not going to have 2 left femurs. So you have a minimum of 2 adult horses, let's say. And so that's one of the kinds of analysis a zooarchaeologist will do. Professor Arnold in our department is a zooarchaeologist. She has enlarged our comparative collection in our lab. She's recovered different animals of different species and processed the animal carcasses to get the bones. We're going to talk a little bit about this so that students and others can look at bones that were recovered from an excavation and compare them to collections that we have and try and identify species. Another kind of analysis that a archaeologist might perform is looking at the different kinds of animals, the amounts, and then trying to figure out how much meat was obtained probably from each animal source. So obviously a deer will give you more meat than a rabbit, maybe 100 pounds of deer or 50 pounds of meat per, let's say, an average adult deer, maybe 5 pounds of meat for an average adult rabbit. So you would try and estimate, proportion of the diet, how much of it came from meat. So this is the metapodial of a white-tailed deer. One of the things that you're going to see is that this is an adult, and the way that you could tell that is because the epiphyses, or the ends of the long bone, are fused. If this was a subadult or juvenile, and this animal had deceased and you recovered the bones, these ends would not be fused. They would actually be able to be removed. It's throughout adulthood or throughout a life of an animal, bones fuse at different rates, as we're going to talk about. Okay, so as you can see here, this is what biologists sometimes refer to as homology or homologous structures. That is, you'll have the same kinds of bones among different mammal species, but the actual morphology or the actual characteristics of the bones will be slightly different in each species, which will allow you to identify, based on, let's say, this bone here, allow you to identify what species that bone came from, because many times when you're excavating, you don't get really, really nice, clear, whole bones. A lot of times you get fragments. So you work from fragments, you try to identify what part of the animal they came from, what species, etc., etc. In order to do this, you need a good comparative collection. Comparative collections are basically carcasses that have been processed so that of animals from different species and different ages, and different sexes as well, in a collection, so that when you have, let's say, a bone that you can't identify, you could compare it to one of these comparative collections and figure that out. What you guys are going to have to do, since you don't have access to all these comparative collections, you'll be using a handbook of pictures in order to identify the species of some bones that I am going to provide as a 3D model again. Okay, so in order to do this, if, let's say, you are making your own zooarchaeology lab, and you are able to obtain the remains of animals that are deceased, and you want to prepare them so that you only have the skeletal remains, there are different ways that you could do this. You could boil the flesh off the animal. You could also use what some labs use, which are flesh-eating beetles called domestic beetles. As you can see, this is a bear skull, and over time these beetles eat the flesh right off of the bone, and at the very end you're left with a completely clean bone, which is not going to continue to rot or give off a smell. It can be stored in your lab safely. Okay, so one thing that you can look at using animal bones, of course, is diet. But there are many different aspects of diet that you can actually look at. A general thing that you might want to study is, what was the lifestyle of the people living at the site where you obtained these animal bones? Did they hunt wild animals? Did they rear domestic animals? Was it a combination where they did some hunting but also had some domesticated animals? We're going to talk about domestication as well during this week. Or was it something like agriculture, where it was large-scale herding or large-scale use of domesticated animals and maybe a few wild animals? Another thing that you could do is look at butchery patterns. So when you find animal bones, you can see, okay, which kinds of bones are found in which households. How is the animal processed after it's killed? One of the things that different cuts of meat can tell you is possibly status of people. So if you find, let's say, the ends of the long bones in certain households versus, let's say, some of the vertebrae or ribs in other households, that might indicate to you that there was different status among those households, because different cuts of meat have different values, and some cuts are very low grade and cheap, and some cuts are very high grade and very expensive, right? So for example, the ends of the long bones are usually kind of lower there. You can see also things like chuck. This is sort of the ground beef You go, let's say, to the butcher section in Meijer, and you get chopped chuck or ground, ground beef. It's going to be on the cheaper end. Something like filet mignon, or tenderloin, that's going to be on the higher end. And so these different cuts have different values. And if different households had different cuts of meat, maybe what that might indicate is that you have, let's say, elites in one area and non-elites in another area, or that people had access to different cuts of meat, for example. So when you look at this cow kind of sort of chalked up here, you can see $16 for a section like that, or $30 for a section like that, and then you're talking about $375 for a section like that. That would be something like a fillet. So a nice piece of meat from the top that would be very, very tender. That would be like your filet mignon. And not just in the butcher shop, but of course, if you went to a steakhouse, and you had a burger, that would run you maybe $15 in a steakhouse, maybe $20 if it was like a expensive steakhouse, and a good sized piece of filet mignon could be somewhere like $50 if you went to a place like one of the steakhouses downtown. Another thing that you can look at, and this is related to climate and the discussion that we had about climate a few weeks ago, is the study of animal bones can also help you reconstruct ancient climate. This is something we alluded to and talked a little bit about a few weeks ago. But if you see different species through time in an area, it might indicate that there has been a change from warmer temperatures to colder temperatures, or from colder temperatures to warmer temperatures, right? So, for example, this is showing you percentages of different animals per time in a North American site. And you can see this is kind of the earlier levels, and these are the later levels. And what you see is that earlier on you have more red deer than reindeer. And then as you go through time, the red deer decreases and the amount of reindeer increases. And what this is probably indicating is a shift from warmer temperatures to colder temperatures, because reindeer and caribou would predominate in colder temperatures, whereas red deer, white-tailed deer, species like that would predominate more in warmer temperatures. So you can also reconstruct climate, the ecology, the local environment. One of the other things that you guys are going to explore on your own using an exercise is something that we call seasonality, right? That is, what season of the year, what time of the year were people actually living at the site? This helps you determine if people were mobile, if they were foragers, or if they were permanently settled in an area all year round. If certain animals are available at certain times of the year, you have, let's say, those animals in that site, but you don't have animals, let's say, from another time of the year, then you were able to determine, people were living there during one season, but not in another season, which means that this was a seasonally occupied site. It was not occupied all year round. For example, you could use antlers, right? So deer shed their antlers at certain times of the year. It's about I think this time of the year or the winter. And you could tell a shed antler versus an antler that has been cut off of an animal that has been hunted. And so if you find shed antler at the site, people were living there at a certain time of the year, but maybe not during another time of the year. So you have to use animal bones, plant remains, and other things in order to document this. And this is something that you're going to actually work on. Right, because birds, let's say, so if you were working in North America and you found bones of Canada geese, okay, then people are there in sort of the mid-fall and also the spring when they migrate to this area. If let's say you have a 6-month-old animal of a certain type, and you know that animal gives birth around the spring, you would add 6 months to that, and you would know people were living at that site at that time. You could also look at the antlers, like we said before, and tooth growth, shell growth, and other things that give you an idea of when people were living there. And this is very important because we can then document when mobile hunters and gatherers started to settle down and live in sites permanently. And this gives us a real idea of how things changed over time, and eventually in some areas, how, as we're going to talk about, how agriculture developed.